before we do anything else, let's spend a little time trying to answer this basic question: how and why we write. That's the basis, the underlying emphasis of the whole class that we'll be going through for the next 16 weeks. And essentially, you've got three different buzzwords there at the bottom, three different subtopics: audience, purpose, and rhetoric. You're going to get sick of hearing all three of these words, probably, but they're sort of the building blocks that we're going to use to further your writing and hopefully help you enter the academic community. Audience and purpose, those things are always tied together. Whenever you commit yourself to writing or speaking, you should always be focused on who the audience is and what you want to accomplish. And rhetoric, as we'll discuss at length through the course of the semester, is what you do to accomplish that purpose with that audience. Okay, so we're going to get into a little bit more detail, but that's our basic overview. Before we move in even further, though, let's start with this metaphor. It's called the Burkean parlor. This may not be a new quote to some of you, but if it is, I'll give you a little background. Kenneth Burke, the man who wrote this metaphor, is an important literary and rhetorical scholar from the 20th century. And his message here, which I won't read verbatim because it's there on the screen in front of you, is a pretty good metaphor, not just for how you write a researched argument, but also how you participate in the world of ideas, how you participate in the academic community, or really any community you want to join. So if you pull apart this metaphor, and you may want to pause the video just so you have a chance to read it, but as you pull it apart, you notice there are really kind of three phases here. No matter what idea you're coming to, no matter what field you're entering, what subject you want to study, you're always going to come late to the conversation. There will always have been people working on this before you, talking about this before you, and writing about this before you. So your job is first to listen and find out what's already being said, and not just what is being said, but how it's being said, what rules are being obeyed, what the values seem to be. And only once you really feel like you've got a bit of a grasp on it, then you start looking for what's missing. Some people call this the gap. If you're trying to do research, you find the gap, what hasn't been said. What can you contribute that hasn't been contributed before? And then you make your contribution to the best of your ability, obeying all of those rules that you observed before. And then once you do that, you have to leave. You can't help it. You have to go. At some point, you do have to publish your work, and then your part is done, and the conversation goes on after you. This is absolutely what you're going to be doing in the research process, and it's probably what you're going to be doing in your fields once you choose your majors and once you progress. It's a pretty good metaphor for a lot of things, but it's certainly the one we'll be using in class. Now, just moving a little bit further, I know it feels in this class a lot of the time like what you're working toward is just producing a research paper. But really what we're working on in this class is producing knowledge. And as you can see in this diagram, we really have three different components that go together to produce any kind of knowledge. There's the writer, the person who's making the statement, the audience, who is also making the statement, because in a conversation, and writing is a conversation, and the process of writing is certainly many conversations, the audience contributes to making that meaning too. And it is kind of an interesting debate to get into, and hopefully we'll have a chance to delve into that some more about to what degree the writer is responsible for the message and to what degree the audience takes on over that meaning. But since we're focusing on writing in this class, remember, everything that you are going to be doing to produce that text, the third element, is hopefully being done to influence the audience in the way you want them to be influenced, to create that knowledge. So, bearing in mind those three components, which we'll come back to in a little bit more detail just in a second, let's pause and spend a little time on vocabulary. Now, some of these are things that we'll talk about in more depth as we go forward, but just to give you a basic idea to get you through these first couple of weeks, these are important terms for us. The first is metacognition, which we'll focus on in depth this first week. But metacognition is thinking about your own thought, monitoring yourself, understanding not just what you know, but why you know it, how you know it, and who you are because of it. Okay, so learning to separate yourself and your biases from anything that you think of as objective. Paying attention to that distinction. It's an important step in becoming a critical thinker and a critical writer. Next up, context. Context is key. Context is, I like to think of it as territory. Everything that surrounds a text or an idea. It's the history. It's other conversations taking place. It's all of that stuff that was going on in the Burkean parlor before you got there. Very closely tied, if you look down the list, to the rhetorical situation, which we'll just jump down here. The rhetorical situation, that second word situation, should give you a clue. It's anything that influences the way you would speak or write well. So who is the audience? What is the setting that you're in? What do you need to take into consideration in order to speak effectively or to write effectively? That's the rhetorical situation. What are the rules? What do you have to pay attention to? What makes this situation different from another situation where you might be talking about the same issue? And we'll jump back up here. Rhetoric, then, is hard to define for a lot of people, but the classical definition is the available means of persuasion. That comes from Aristotle. It's ancient. Essentially, rhetoric, for our purposes, is whatever you do in order to influence your audience in whatever way you want to influence them. When you're making an argument, you need your audience to agree with you by the end. What strategies are you employing in order to get that message across? Now, rhetoric is a big field. It's the whole field that covers the class that we're in and beyond. But as we discuss rhetoric going forward, that's a good key thing to keep in mind. It's whatever you do in order to influence your audience. Persuasion is usually tied in with rhetoric. Okay, discourse, then. That's anything that's written or spoken or communicated about a subject. It's what we think of as the conversation. It's the thing that's going on in that Burkean parlor. Now, discourse is sort of like rhetoric. It's a big term that gets used very loosely, very broadly sometimes. But if you can conceive of it as the conversation happening in that parlor, it's a pretty good rule of thumb. The discourse community, on the other hand, this is going to be part of your rhetorical situation and then a big part of the context. It's going to determine the rhetoric that you use. It's the group of people who are interested and versed in that subject. And if you're part of a discourse community, that means you care about your subject. That means you have some interest in it, something at stake, and you need to be part of any conversation that takes place around that issue. So this could be your major, this could be your job, your field of work, this could be your hobby or your interest. If, for example, you do yoga, then you're part of perhaps the discourse community of people who talk about yoga. If you are interested in college basketball, then you're part of the discourse community that surrounds college basketball. You know the rules that people use to talk about the thing. You know the language that people use. You understand what the issues are and what matters. As you all are learning to be part of the academic community, you're joining the broad discourse community of the university. You're joining the discourse community of your field. In this class, you're joining the discourse community of people who pay attention to argument and to rhetorical strategies. And implied here is that that discourse community will have a shared set of goals and values that you also need to pay attention to. This is a big part of paying attention to your audience. Okay, now here's something to keep in mind. Writers always write for one purpose, and that's to get a message across. So if you look at this triangle, all of these things you can see as components of what makes up what we call an author. That means they've got a motive and a purpose. They've done some research and grounding, paid attention to the discourse community, allowed that to influence them, and be part of their own background and biases. As you're writing or as you're analyzing somebody else's writing, don't forget to look for these things. What's the motive? What's the purpose? What research background has this writer done? How have they stewed in other people's ideas? And then also, what backgrounds and biases is that author bringing with him or her? Similarly, the audience is going to be influenced by backgrounds and biases, by things that matter to them, their stakes, their incentives, the rhetorical situation, the discourse community that the message is going to. The audience determines the rhetoric that you'll be using in order to be persuasive if you are the writer. And then texts. We tend to think of texts sometimes as things that exist without writers or audiences, but you know that that's not the case. Texts exist within that conversation between an author and an audience. They're going to be influenced by the writer's purpose. They're going to be influenced by the context and the rhetorical situation of the audience. And they're going to be rhetorical documents that hopefully will be organized and clear in order to appeal to that audience and to the standards that are part of this discourse community. Okay, now here's what we'll consider in this class, and sort of already have said this, but just to be clear, when we look at authors, and that means you or any author that you are analyzing for the purpose of this class, we're going to be metacognitive, we're going to pay attention to biases, we're going to question what is objective truth, and then what are just subjective conclusions. Is there evidence behind an idea? We're going to talk about how to research well as an author, how to join that community. And we're also going to talk about how you establish your credibility and your authority as somebody who, and it's implied in the word authority, has the right to speak about something. Now, granted, that moves us a little bit over into the audience. When we do audience analysis, we're going to pay attention to the stakes for an audience. Why would it matter to them? Who does it matter to? We're going to pay attention to the history and biases, the discourse and community, and the language that is important to that audience. What language will be effective? What do they care about? What's the history of this issue and this audience? What's this audience's history with that issue? We're also going to think about what questions an audience might have, and then also what needs an audience. What do we need to explain in order to get our idea across to that audience? Finally, when we look at texts, that means looking at somebody else's writing to analyze it, or looking at your own to revise it. What's the clarity of the purpose? Do we know what it's for? How clear is the organization? Can I follow it? Is it getting me where I need to be smoothly? Is the language clear? Is the intention clear? Is that apparent in the language? How tailored is this text to its rhetorical situation and discourse community? So you can see how all of these things tie in together. All of the different heuristics and analyses that we will go through together in class will be geared toward doing this kind of thing, tying language to meaning and paying attention to influences. And I'm really looking forward to working with all of you this semester.